Hey everyone, back in my car again. I think I'm wearing the same shirt I was wearing yesterday, but yeah. So someone asked me to make a video about life fallout after psych meds and how to rebuild, or what that process is like. And I wanted to comment on that because this has come up in several conversations that I've had with people as well. And the truth is that like a lot of people do lose a lot in their lives due to withdrawal and adverse effects from these drugs. So I myself, it was one of the reasons why my relationship ended. It was the reason I lost my jobs. It was the reason that I had to move home and live with my mom at 37 after being out on my own for 17 years away from home in another city. It's the reason why I went on disability. It's the reason why, I had these compounding health problems. So really every area of your life, when you look at money, income, family, friendships, lifestyle, health, everything gets affected when people have severe withdrawal reactions or severe adverse reactions to these drugs. And and that's one of the many sad aspects of this journey. Aside from all of the horrible symptoms that people get, neurological, physical, emotional, mental, all of that aside, then you have all of, like, it's such a layered issue. And I talk to people about this. We kind of unravel these layers in conversations, because people look at it as, oh, you're going through a withdrawal, and they don't, like, I'm talking about people who haven't experienced this. And so most people think of withdrawal as short term, although it can be very intense for people. If you think about drugs, alcohol, it's usually pretty short lived. And then there is post-acute withdrawal syndrome in alcohol. I know that. I can't speak to other illicit drugs because I haven't been through that. But typically, from my understanding, is that withdrawals are pretty short-lived, even though they can be intense. Whereas this experience, especially for people affected by these drugs severely and who are in protracted withdrawal, this can affect your life for a very long period of time. So not only do you have to deal with symptoms for much longer than you would typically deal with withdrawal symptoms from other substances, but you have multiple layers in addition to that. So one of them is all of the gaslighting in the medical community, which is really sad, because you have the doctors who, especially if you're trying to do, or you're going to do a slow taper, then you need a doctor who's willing to prescribe you the drugs for long enough, especially if you're on benzos. And some doctors are only willing to prescribe short term, or any of these drugs. Like, you need a prescriber that is willing to be with you in this for the long haul, because they're the ones who give you the drug. So you have to deal with that. And a lot of that comes with gaslighting and saying, well, it's not possible for you to have withdrawal at all. Or if they acknowledge that there is withdrawal from these drugs, they'll say, oh, it's 1 to 6 weeks or whatever it is. It's usually just a few weeks, and then once the drug is out of your system, then you go back to normal. That's usually the attitude that they have. So you have the gaslighting. And then if you, at least where I live in Canada, end up on disability, like I was for a couple of years because of these drug problems, then you have to have a doctor that's on board and willing. Like, you have to maintain a relationship with a doctor. Luckily, I found one who understood a lot of what I was going through and was willing to literally do anything for me. He told me that. But I realized that that's more of an exception and not the rule. And so you have to have a relationship with a doctor who's willing, again, to prescribe you the drugs long enough if you're doing a slow incremental taper or hyperbolic or whatever you do. And you need a doctor on board if you end up on disability, because they have to sign your papers, they have to advocate for you, there's a lot of paperwork that goes into that. And so you have to maintain a relationship with a medical team, and are often gaslit and abandoned. All sorts of horrible things happen. You're told, you're thrown in the psych ward because they just say you're mentally ill. As we know, there's all these problems that go into it. Then there's the isolation part. So depending on people's circumstances, if you're married or if you live with your family or you live alone or whatever it might be, there's so much isolation because people don't understand. There's hardly any widespread information about these long long protracted withdrawal syndromes. Thankfully, there's more information coming out, but people have to deal with all of the isolation that goes, and that's why the withdrawal communities exist, which, as I've talked about in other videos, are double-edged swords, because it's great for figuring out what's going on with you if you have no idea, or what's wrong, and you can find amazing supports in there, but then usually people scare themselves half to death in there. There's horror stories on every level, and so that they're a double-edged sword, but they're a place for people to come together who are sharing this experience. So obviously they can be good as well, but this situation is so isolating for those reasons. And some have family members that eventually, come to terms or believe the person and do their own research, or are willing to listen and read whatever the person's suffering is sharing with them, and so they come on board and they're like, wow, like this is exactly what's happening to you, and we support you through this. And some people have that and other people don't. So I've talked to many people who are going through this experience physically completely alone, so they don't live with anybody, they're not married, they don't have children, and so the online communities are their really only source of support. So there's the isolation, there's the gaslighting and the misunderstanding and the negligence and abandonment, and then there's the symptoms themselves and the length of time that people go through these symptoms, which can be very long for some people. And so there's that, and then there's the fallout of everything else, loss of job, loss of income, loss of potential, your marriage or relationship with your kids or your parents, depending on how they receive the experience and their own beliefs about it, and what they're willing to accept and acknowledge. There's financial, there's everything. I mean, what you once knew suddenly is no more for a lot of people, especially people who have severe protracted symptoms. That was the case for me. My whole life was turned upside down. Like I shared, didn't have income because I couldn't work, because I couldn't sleep, because my symptoms were too intense. It was part of the reason my relationship broke down, moving back home when I'm almost 40 after being alone for many years, everything I outlined at the beginning of this video. And that's a lot of people's experience. And so how do you rebuild, or what does that look like? So when people are going through this, and again, because they are so isolated, and there's many people who don't have that support in person, so getting through, and I've made videos about this before, especially when you're in acute, the hope and the support are the two biggest things that people need, because for a lot of us there is no other option, because people will throw things at it, they'll throw supplements at it, they'll do every type of alternative therapy under the sun, or they'll reinstate, and a lot of times those things don't work, or they make the situation worse. I actually reinstated multiple times. The first time was 6 months or 7 months off my first drug. I only did it for a week. I had a bad reaction, but I reinstated at a pretty high dose. And then 2 years after that, once I finally understood withdrawal and these processes a lot better, I still decided to reinstate because I was struggling so much in protracted, and that went horribly wrong. And I took all kinds of different drugs, and I did that for 3 to 4 months. And so my journey was really, really long, and I can't remember where I was going with that, but it ends up taking so much from you, and it can be for a really long time. And like I've said before, the acute is where you mostly need hope and support, and then as you go into subacute and potentially protracted, that's where sometimes people will revisit those other things, like addressing deficiencies and addressing if they have gut health issues or liver problems, and that's not the be all and end all, and it helps some people through to healing and other people don't, or it doesn't work for them. And so there is, though, once people start to get better. So this could be windows and waves when they finally start experiencing that. Or if you're someone who has a little bit more of a linear healing, which is not very common. Or if you have a rapid healing where you've been feeling bad for really long and then suddenly you start to feel better or more functional. Then what? Then what happens? How do you start over, essentially? And I've had conversations with people about this, that it really is, it's like building a house one brick at a time. You have to, and my own philosophy on going through this is the lulling and stretching, I think is Coach Powers, what he uses. I've called it nurturing and stretching. So lots of self-care, lots of taking care of the nervous system as best you can, but trying to stretch yourself when you're feeling a little bit stronger, either in a window or as you are healing and you just have a little bit of a higher baseline. And that's when you do start rebuilding. And that can be extreme for some people. Like for people who have lost absolutely everything, that can be a very small, like a very like incremental brick by brick rebuilding. And so I'll share my own experience because so I moved home with my mom when I was already 10 months after my week-long reinstatement. So I was about 18 months off my first drug and I really was not doing well. So I moved back home with my mom and away from my relationship and where I had friends and my whole life essentially. So move home, and all it was for the first how long was I back? About a year. It was basically just trying to get through and trusting that I would get better and trusting that I would get better. And I was still only dealing with a first withdrawal at that point. Then I decided to reinstate about a year after I came back home because mentally I was so bad still, and that went totally awry and actually completely debilitated me, because up to that point I was still working, and although I had lost my relationship and my familiarity in the city that I had been living in for years before I moved back home to my hometown, I was still functioning enough that I could work, but mentally I was really bad. But physically I had gotten a lot better. But my reinstatement was for the purposes of my mental symptoms being so bad. And like you, if you've been following me for a while, you know that my reinstatement went horribly wrong. Then I became completely debilitated and I had to go on disability. So it was literally starting from the ground up essentially. So I was living with my mom, and I understand that not everybody has that resource. Some people don't have that, but whatever your situation is, I'm just sharing my own experience with the rebuilding part. So once I had come off my second set of 9 drugs that I did during my reinstatement, it was essentially for the first 6 months just constantly plugging into my supports. And I've shared that many times. I wasn't even thinking about work. I wasn't even thinking about anything else at all. It was just or moving out on my own or doing anything. It was basically pure survival. And I had my support group that I talked to 12 hours a day. So I did that for many months. And then as things, I started getting windows and waves. And then at 22 months off, my second round was when I started feeling better. That was when things started. I started to think about going back to work and what would that look like. And so the way that I chose to do it was I ended up taking a short course online, and that taught me how to be a virtual assistant. And for me, it was perfect for someone recovering from these drugs because you can work from home. You can work as few or as many hours as you want. You typically can work when you want. You're not tied to a schedule. You find clients and then you work out a contract with them, and you essentially, as long as you're meeting your deadlines, which is they're not very tight deadlines, then you can work whenever. And so it was the perfect rebuild as far as work goes for me, because I could slowly transition. So I started working 5 hours a week, and then I moved up from there. And when I was coaching, that happened completely unplanned. I had an old YouTube channel in my first withdrawal that I deleted, and then I started another YouTube channel when I felt like I was recovering from my second withdrawal, which I was about 22 months off, I think, when I started making videos again. And people just started asking me, hey, can I chat with you? Like, I really need to chat with you. And it happened really informally. But my plan and what I had been doing to start that work rebuild part was the virtual assistant stuff. And like I said, I started with 5 hours and I worked my way up as I got stronger and stronger. To be honest, I still don't have friends, and I don't know what would happen if I went back to my old city and tried. I feel like, because what I had done in the past, like before this happened to me, I was a nonprofit manager and I worked and managed group homes, and everybody that I worked with except for one person was heavily on psych drugs. And back then I was completely oblivious to psychiatry and the harms of psychiatry, so I would never be able to go back into that type of work. Never. I used to administer medications. I used to I was in charge. So I took them to their psychiatrist appointments. Like I would never be able to do that again. And a lot of the friends that I had were from that job. And so I don't know. I mean, obviously we can separate work from having the friendships, but it would be hard because what we always talked about was our job. And so I have such a different perspective on all that now. It wouldn't quite be the same. So I still have my online friends, but I don't really have friends in person. I'm not gonna lie. And then as far as like integrating back into normalcy, it was not easy because something so pivotal in my life had happened. And for me, it was 4.5 years from coming off my first drug in 2018 till I started feeling better in 2022. So my life had profoundly changed in every way. And so it was hard for me to even start, I guess, socializing and doing things with family and anything social at all, because how do you even bring this up? And if you are like me and you've experienced this, where it's hard to talk outside of this community with regular people who don't understand this, and who so for instance, like my whole extended family lives in the town that I'm in now, and I was gone from here for 17 years. And so I have cousins and uncles and aunts, and it was hard because when I started spending time with them again, like it's like you want to share what you've been through, but people don't understand. So I mean, I have shared it publicly. Obviously, I put it on my social media. Most people are aware of it, but I had really negative responses from some people in my family, close people in my family, and it's actually caused a divide, and they just don't get it. Again, like it's that gaslighting, it's that unwillingness to listen and hear me out and hear my story. And so I kind of gave up trying to convince people of what I had been through, even in my own family. So now that I'm feeling way better, I can have, like yesterday, for instance, I was at a family member's house having coffee. I can have normal conversations about normal things again, but it was a tough transition because it's such a huge part of your life. And then when you feel better and you try to like reintegrate, it's like going into this alien world where your whole perceptions have changed about everything a lot of the times, how you view the world, because it's so traumatic for such a long time. And trying to reconnect with, again, I don't really have the option of reconnecting with old friends because they all live in different cities, but even with family, it can be a real challenge. And I had some family members who really supported me all the way through, and I'm so grateful for them, and I feel closer than ever to them. But there's been ones who have had quite the opinion of me, and that's really difficult, I'm not gonna lie. And so I talked about the financial rebuild, and it was tough because, you know, a lot of people go into tremendous amounts of debt, and, you know, if you even have I think it's different here in Canada. From my understanding, it's easier to get disability here than in other countries. So I had that to my advantage. So I didn't lose everything, but I mean the amount that you get for disability is laughable, but at least it's something. So I had that on my side, and I realized not everybody does. But when I was trying to get back into making a livable wage, it was something that was a slow rebuilding process. And I still have debt from it, and that I'm working to pay off. And so that part, and then there's the family, the friends, and even with the ramifications of this, because people will ask me, what about all the trauma? And my own experience, and those that I've talked to, people that I've coached who are recovering or are recovered, and also people from my own support group and people from back in my acute days who are doing well now, a lot of people will say that the trauma eventually fades, and they'll say, you know, it's like I can think about it, but it doesn't have that same gut-wrenching effect on me that it once did. And that was my own experience too, is that you think that you're going to be traumatized forever. And for me, medically, I still feel traumatized. But as far as getting back to your day-to-day life, you slowly, like the horrific horrors and memories of it slowly fade. I mean, that was my experience. That was a lot of other people's experiences that I've talked to who have recovered. Maybe not straight across the board. There's probably other people, maybe they had pre-existing trauma, or just the way that they process things is different, and maybe they need some extra help and they feel more traumatized, and it's more difficult for them to maybe reintegrate. But a lot of times once the symptoms lift, you feel so grateful to be able to do normal things again, enjoy a cup of coffee, enjoy reading a book on the patio, enjoying watching a TV show, listening to music, talking to people, because you just have felt like you've been in this hell for so long. And so for me, it was more like, I feel so grateful that I can experience these things again. But I still have a hard time. For me, the hardest things are still the medical trauma. So I still don't trust doctors. I still try to avoid them and medication as much as possible. And the spiritual part, I still really struggle with. And I've shared that in videos, like how could a loving God allow people to suffer like this for so long, even though I begged, borrowed, pleaded, knelt down, was on my face, was anointed, was prayed over by multiple different groups, multiple different times. It never made a difference. And so I still struggle with my spirituality and what I actually believe in now. So that's how it's been for me. And as you're going through it, and because a lot of people experience windows and waves, or an improved baseline after a wave, it's, in my opinion, best to just do that slow rebuild. You know, whether it's visiting, making money, or just being around regular people again, or doing normal activities. It's just like one thing at a time. So for instance, there's someone that I've been talking to for quite a long time who really struggled with just surviving, and now that they're feeling better and a lot more functional, it's been kind of one thing at a time, trying one event, trying, you know, and having a plan. How long am I going to stay? Am I going to leave early? Do I need someone with me? Even things like going to the store or driving a car again. It's like you start with, you know, a 2-minute trip and then you build up. So that's seems to be what is helpful for most people, is that slow reintegration and I guess re-exposing yourself to regular things. And I'm not talking about, you know, going back and drinking alcohol or doing anything crazy. I'm talking about just normal life that this steals from people for a long time. And I hope that is answering the question. If you guys have any further comments or questions about this, let me know in the comments. I'm just trying to think of if I've forgotten anything, because I kind of covered the spiritual side, financial, going back to work, reintegrating and doing normal things with regular people, you know, addressing the trauma part of it and my own experience with it, the continued distrust of the medical community and doctors, that still is part of my life. What else? Yeah, and just putting the pieces back together. It's slow, but I'm telling you, like, my own experience and many others I've talked to who are better, it's just like you just feel grateful and happy that you can be free again. And like I said, there's some lingering trauma, but that tends to fade for people. And if it doesn't naturally fade, then there's nothing wrong or shameful about getting extra help through that. And that looks different for different people, just like a process like of grief looks different for different people. That's the way I see it. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Let me know if you have any further ones and how you guys are doing, and I'll see you next time. Bye.